Welcome to the adventures of self. Conversations with ordinary and extraordinary people as they explore what it means to be self-expressed. Come on in. Join the adventure.
So, welcome to the Adventures of Self, Charlie Sheldon.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. Charlie, you've got a broad, varied, colorful life and history. And one of the things that you've done sort of most recently, I think, to start to bring all of your experience in life together is to create stories. And I love a good story. So I want to just start with your understanding and your creation, of stories.
Okay. I've always liked stories, let's say. I mean, right from the earliest time, and great storytellers were a gift to have before you. And I was lucky. I've heard a few. The guy I used to fish with years ago was a great storyteller. So we'd finish a long day and we'd be working for 16 hours and be sitting down at the forecastle table about to have dinner, and he'd start talking. And most of us knew he's telling a story, but he'd have long pauses, so he'd say something and there'd be a long pause. And the guys who didn't know he was telling a story would think they could talk about something. And pretty quick, they realized, no, shut up and listen. And he'd finally tell this story. And I really admired that. And I wanted to be able to tell stories, right? And that's what I've sought to do. But stories come to you. They don't. It's hard to just sit down and invent one. I think I would say about the most recent stories I've done, even all of them, but the three I've done in the last 11 years, I didn't have much choice about it. They came to me, honestly. First, wondering about an old legend, and then kind of wondering about how would you write about this place on the earth that I like so much. And I started just pondering that. I pondered it for years, and eventually the story emerged, I guess. So why do you tell stories? You don't know. I mean, I'd written some novels earlier, but they weren't written the same way. They started with a premise, and then I'd write the story around the premise. Very casual, almost flippant. Like one of the stories I wrote, which I never got very far with, I finished it, but basically asked the question, what happens if the girl running out of the bank with the money gets in the wrong car? I mean, that was the basis, or another story was, a guy picks up a girl in a hotel and they're in bed, and at the worst possible moment, someone breaks in and takes their picture, and then they have to work together to save their reputations, right? So that was almost frivolous, just a vehicle to a caper. I guess I'd call it a caper. And of course, so that was what I started with. But these latest ones then it merged a little bit. Then I wanted to write about something I loved, right? So I wrote a story about rowing, the racing with rowing crew, which I did as an addiction for many years. And I wanted to write some fiction about rowing because there isn't much, right? And I wrote a story about that. But this latest series of stories, I wanted to deal with more complicated issues, right? And I'm older, so maybe that's the reason I want to deal with that. And I wanted to deal with asking some sort of fundamental questions, like what is it that makes us human beings? What is it that drives people to go where they go and do what they do? and I'd have to say it's almost not a choice. It's really almost something you're driven to do. And many writers will say that they're not that they're believe me, being a writer is mostly a pretty miserable existence.
Yeah.
It's mostly pretty humiliating and difficult. So.
Well, yeah, it's humiliating. It's humiliating. It's difficult. It's very lonely.
Well, it's lonely. Actually, though, honestly, the time for me, the time I'm in that place where the story's appearing is a magical time, though it may be frustrating. And I actually really believe that this is another thesis, that every hour that someone spends in that creating space, whether it's writing or making music or even doing something they love to do, I don't think any of those hours are taken away from your time or take away from your time on Earth. I mean, if you could be in that space all the time, you'd live forever, I think, in some ways. And so that's the pleasure of writing, is the time when you're doing it and watching the story appear. But the way I work, and people, I will write a draft within 3 or 4 months of the basic story, and then it takes me 2 or 3 years to fiddle with it and tinker with it and get it right. But during that 3 or 4 months when I'm writing the draft, and then subsequent times when I go back into it to rewrite it, that's nice when you're in that place. But the times in between, when you're not working on it, but you're doubting yourself and you're wondering about it and you think it's crummy, they're not very pleasant. Excuse me.
Yeah, and you, you kind of cracked the lid on what I've experienced, and as you say, what certainly a lot of writers talk about is a very common experience in terms of the writing process. So there's a couple things. One, I think a lot of people, when they start writing, they come up with an idea and then they write the idea, right? And that's a good way to learn or practice a craft. It helps you with structure, whether that's sentence structure, paragraph structure, chapter structure, how to create a character. But it's quite craft focused. And what you were talking about, right? That stories come to you. Where, how, why? Well, where does anything come from, really? And so there almost becomes like a possession. There's something in you that must be told, right? That sort of has to come out. As you say, like a lot of artists, writers, but I think also, painters or musicians feel this. They know exactly what's there. The challenging part is actually getting it out cleanly, because we have such an editing, filtering thing that goes in. Like you say, you can kind of relatively quickly churn out, say, the first draft in a few months, but refining that, getting that to what the essence and the beauty of the story is. I remember reading, like, I wanted to be a writer, and I as a teenager I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut.
Yep.
And I loved Vonnegut, and his ability to, with so few words, tell so much. And then I read an interview with him, and he said, well, writing is really only 10% writing. The other 90% is editing. And I was relatively lazy, and I thought, I don't like that. I'm going to run away from that, because I just want it to come like a magical thing, and then it's done. There is a lot of that other process, and it's where, as you say, a lot of the doubt, a lot of the challenge comes in of, well, is this any good? What did I write? This needs to change. And and you're writing, just to be clear, I mean, you're writing long novels,
right?
Yeah.
I'm not a short story writer. I mean, I've written short stories, and I won some prizes actually years, and when I was in high school. But that was mostly because I didn't have the energy to write anything longer. But I wanted to write novels, and you're right, it's a long time. And interestingly, the first novels I wrote, tried to write, until the characters came alive to me, I'd struggle, you know, and it wasn't until at least two characters came alive that that the story started to happen. And I'd have to write my way into those characters appearing. I mean, I'm very visual, and the image I had was of kind of this form emerging from a pool of lava or mud, you know, and dripping off. And as it strides from the pool, the lava flows off, and finally, when he's walking away, it's a human being. And that's the kind of, I was writing my way into that character, be able to walk on his or her own. And the first 2 or 3 books were like that, but this last series of books, which I started almost 11 years ago, I did it differently. I had this notion about, could this old legend be true about people always being here? And I wanted to write about something that celebrated the Olympics in the Gulf of Alaska. And I wanted a sea story, and I wanted a wilderness story. And I wanted to put a kid in a high stress situation and survive it. But what I did, I don't know why I did it, but what I did, maybe because I didn't have the time to write the way I wanted, was I just did research about this notion. And I did 3 years of research and filled notebook after notebook with notes. And it was all the way from biology and geology and archaeology and even Carl Jung, you know, and human development and genetics. And all that research kind of sat in my brain for that period, right? And when I started actually writing the first of the 3 stories, man, it was easy. The characters are all there. Something was going on unconsciously in my brain, I think, with all that research, such that when I started writing, literally, the characters just appeared. And then no longer was I struggling to get them to appear. They were there. They were demanding attention. And for these last 3 books that I've done, that's been the case. The characters have just appeared. It's been easy. That's been easy. And I think the other thing I'd say is that, you know, you write the first rough draft in 3 or 4 months at 100,000 words or whatever it is. And then it takes 3 years to move things around and reposition things and basically cut away everything that you don't need. And that's the challenge in the end, to only have the words in the book that have to be in the book for the story to be told. That's my view of it.
Yeah, I read. I mean, I tend to write short stories. Don't have the patience or the belief right now in novels, although I can see them starting to emerge. And I remember reading Stephen King's book on writing, which is a fantastic resource for you know, kind of showing how writing happens. You know, a very, very prolific writer, very creative writer, and he, you know, really talked about that editing and the precision of words. And he said, whatever you write, your first draft, when you go back, cut at least 20%. You know, it's just like, just slash it, you know, because then we can get very precious with the words. No, but this part means something, and you know.
What I do, and this is just for me, and again, there's 500,000 books a year produced now. There's just thousands of people writing, and it's a huge industry. And with self-publishing, it's easy for everyone to be published. And so everyone has an opinion, and unless you have a bestseller, who's going to listen to you, you know? But anyway, you all go through the same thing. But the challenge is that, as a writer, at least for me, especially because I don't outline this book in advance, I just kind of set the situation up and let it happen. But what we writers tend to do is we'll write our way into the story. In other words, sometimes a lot of what we write is just a way to get from one place to another, and you really don't need it. You just go from one place to the other. And I also find, for me, again, this is my thing, that I'll repeat myself without realizing. I'm just blind to seeing that. And that, like the 3rd book, which is now Totem, the first half of it, which became twice as long, it's 130,000 words. But I sent the first half of it to my editor, Pete. You know, this is like 5 years ago now. And it was 70,000 words. It was about your comment about cutting. He handed it back to me, and it was 50,000 words. 20,000 words he took out. And I thought, well, this isn't long, this is no longer long enough to be a novel. But my solution was I added another entire plot line.
Mm.
And part of that was enabled because the structure that I use, as you know from reading that story I did, Adrift, is by using different points of view, you have different stories interweaved with the overall story. So it's relatively easy to add a new storyline into a structure like that. But that's what I did. And I actually improved the book, but you're right. You're, as a writer, you're blind to a lot of the stuff you do yourself. You just can't see it. It's too. That's why everyone needs an editor. Some people hate that, but it's true, I think.
Yeah, and so Adrift is the second of
the second,
the second story in this, and I certainly get allusions to what was happening in the first because the story shows up. And what I was saying to you just beforehand, I mean, it's quite, it's quite a tale, and it does take in quite a number of different aspects. And what really struck me, I mean, the first thing that struck me, and because it was so early on, is how quickly the action starts. Often we kind of, I don't know if it's a rule of writing or just something you kind of get used to. Usually there's a setting, right? It's like, okay, let's get a setting. Let's establish a little bit of homeostasis. There's the balance, and then of course the story is where things go out of balance. Right. And then there's the arc of the story about how to either put that right or things continue to fall apart, and then the world's over. And that's the basis of a story. In Adrift, I don't know, with the first maybe 2 paragraphs, but certainly the first 2 pages, the world is very much out of balance. They talk about an inciting incident in the story.
What's the inciting incidents that starts everything, right? And sometimes people, like you say, they'll start with some backstory to explain. They'll do a little character development to explain. And I'm very much of the view that the characters will reveal themselves, right? And just like the way it is in life, this Steve's asleep in the cabin, his ship catches fire. Let me tell you, that's a nightmare. Fire at sea is a nightmare, and that's how it starts. Within the first paragraph, the ship's burning.
This is a massive freighter ship in the Gulf of Alaska, or the sort of Pacific Northwest in early December. So not exactly calm waters.
Nope.
And what do you do about that, right? So and then the story unfolds. The ship's on fire. The ship is abandoned, and a massive story ensues in that kind of never really lets up. It's like, and as you say, like, there are different strands, because then it comes not just about the people on the ship, but what to do with the ship, who owns the ship, how to rescue the ship, the insurance, and then the people that live in the town where all this happens, and what their story is and how they're involved, and the family members of the people who are on the ship, and a lot about the area, the history of the area, right? That goes into this. I think what you were talking about, this the story of humanity, and you have a particular connection to the Pacific Northwest, where you live and where this story takes place.
Right.
And what has, because you're not from Pacific Northwest, right?
I've been here for 31 years, so no, I'm not.
But you've also been over the entire world sailing for longer than that. So
well, no, it's not. I spent 15 years working in the fishing industry on the East Coast, but I wasn't at sea all those 15 years. I spent maybe 3 to 4 actual years of sea time on boats, and I was a consultant, and I did a bunch of other things, but I was in the industry. And then I worked for seaports for almost 30 years, and then I went back to sea when I was 65 as a merchant sailor for 4 years. So not the, some would say I'm not the brightest bulb in the room, but it actually was I mean, I wanted to keep working. I was 65 years old. I had an opportunity to do this. I'd always wanted to do it. My wife and I talked about it, and we thought, let's do it. And it really worked out. It really worked out well. But and that is only at the last point when I was sailing with Sailors Union of the Pacific that I did some real deep sea sailing. I mean, the routine I was on was New York to Singapore and back through the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. I mean, it was a 70-day round trip, and you'd hit a bunch of ports on the way, and it was definitely an experience. And so I've never actually, and I went up the ferry once. I've been up the Alaska ferry once from Bellingham up to Juneau, so I know what the inside passage looks like. I've actually never been on Haida Gwaii, which is central to the story. I've done a lot of research. I've talked to people up there. But the first book I did has some sea stories in it, but it's really mostly set in the Olympic wilderness. And I just wanted to do a sea story. And this book, really, the main character in this book, you could argue, is the Seattle Express, the ship, and all these things that spin off around the ship. So, I talked to a lot of people who've sailed it, and once you're out of sight of land, if the wind blows, it's the same, basically whether you're in the Indian Ocean or off Antarctica or anywhere, it's the same, and it isn't very pleasant, So, and when I was sailing, with APL and a Sailors Union of the Pacific, a ship fire is pretty much the greatest fear of any sailor. And actually, right now, as we're talking, there was this container ship that caught fire off Colombo, and it burned up, and now it's sinking. And it was a small container ship. And I know exactly. I've been anchored. Our ship anchored. We went into Colombo. I've been to Colombo, and I know exactly where it happened. And the film of that ship burning is terrifying. I mean, just terrifying. So. That's what it did. And as I did the story, and especially as I dealt with the whole question of the salvage tug taking hold of a ship that's abandoned and drifting, I actually ended up communicating with people who ran deep sea tugs, saying, "How would you do this? What's the system? How do you grab a ship if there's no way to if you don't have any power on the ship to unload wines and stuff?" Then they told me, and that's in the story based on what all these guys told me. So it was a collective effort, you could say.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, you do a lot of research, but then that goes into the story, right? It's only useful if it furthers the story. And I definitely remember reading, parts of, like, I knew that you had a working past in the marine world. But I didn't know the extent of it. So I'm reading things like, this is happening, that's happening, and thinking, wow, this guy really knows his stuff. Sounds credible. What do I know? And yeah, there were some really, quite interesting moments, as you say, like because there's a tug that has to connect with I think it's measured as like a 700-foot tanker.
Well, it's a container ship.
Container ship, rather. Yeah, sorry.
700 feet long, which is a small container ship, but a fairly small container ship. But compared to a 130-foot tug, it's fairly big. So first you have to get aboard the ship.
Yeah.
If the weather's bad, there's big seas. How do you get aboard the ship? And then when you get aboard the ship, how do you hook up a line to? Anyway, so that's what I wanted to write about. Some people who read the book, a few people have said, well, there's all these nautical terms and I don't understand them. And that's true. There's some of that. But I felt, well, once you get in the pace of the story, you want the reader to be there in the story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's what I tried to do, and tried to do it in a form where each of the characters, I think for a reader to stay with the story, they have to be interested in the characters who are in the story. And if the character's just there to move the story along, right, then I, at least as a reader, lose interest. So so basically each character has to have their own individual arc of challenge, you know, what do they do to overcome it, and so on, you know, so that, like Steve, the captain of the ship in adrift, his challenge is first rescuing his crew, and then he's got this disabled son he's sailing to pay for in this home, and he doesn't know what to do about it. I mean, that's his issue, and hopefully you as a reader, that makes Steve more interesting than if he's just reporting the events as the captain, but really he's just a figurehead spokesman.
Yeah,
that's the thesis.
Yeah, and there are quite a few characters, and as you say, you kind of use different plot lines to connect them, and also to tell individual stories that overlap, just like life does, right? You know, it's like, well, there's Charlie's story, there's Taylor's story. We come together for this. We go about our separate things, and we might meet up for a drink on Friday night, right, and share what happened. And so it does have this, and because obviously there's the tug. There's, I don't remember how many, but there's a handful of crew, 8 to 12 or something like that, and so there's the story told from one person's viewpoint, and then another person's viewpoint, so they'll overlap. And you were you said that the story just kind of comes out of you, and in particular there is this sense, because although it's quite a harrowing tale, and it just is kind of very fast paced, and things are always happening. Like when you start with the 700-foot ship on fire, and proceed from there, it's quite a story in and of itself. But in particular, sorry, I just forgot the name of the first book. Strongheart, yes.
Strongheart.
Yeah, because I think it certainly picks up in Adrift. There is this sort of magical realism, mythology that underpins a lot. It makes it much more than just a action book that you're kind of waiting to see what happens.
Right,
There's something much more fundamental, much more human, or sort of beyond our human experience, that as you say, like, well, how far back do we go, and what does it mean to be human?
Right. Well, the first book, Strongheart, the thing that whispered at me right from the time I got to Seattle. You see, when I came to Seattle, I came to work at the Port of Seattle. And very early on, I realized when I'm out in the Pacific Northwest that out in the Pacific Northwest, and if you work for a seaport, if you want to do any work in the water, like build a new pier or repair a pier, that's called in-water work. It has to get a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And to do that, the treaty fishing tribes have to agree with the permit so it doesn't upset their habitat. So we had to work with the tribes, and I had an interest in doing that, and I started working with them, and I learned pretty quickly that there's this legend that they've always been here, right? Ever since time began. They didn't come over in the land bridge, they've always been here, i.e. modern humans arose here rather than anywhere else. So humans arose, but they became modern here. Well, there's no science that supports that, but I'm enough of a contrarian. I thought, could that legend be true? And then I thought, how could it be true? And then I thought, wouldn't it be fun to write a story kind of about that? And at the same time, I wanted to write about the Olympic National Park and the beauty in there. So I tried to set it. So that was so the first story was tied in with this idea that it is actually the telling of stories that made us modern humans, the ability to hold culture by memory, by stories of generation by generation. Until we did that, every life would be a new life without any memory of the previous life. And so you had to have some kind of way of transferring culture, and you do it through stories. So what I tried as a structure in the first book, Strongheart, was this guy was telling us a story about what happened one summer, and then Sarah, the girl, she disappears in the first book right after they get started. She sees something, nobody believes her. And what she sees, by the way, which isn't a spoiler, is she goes up the trail to draw something, and she comes back with a drawing of a bear.
Mm.
And they say, "Oh, that's a really realistic looking bear, but it doesn't seem quite right."
Mm.
Then Myra, the archaeologist who works the tribe, she says later to her father, William, she says, "Sarah didn't misdraw something. What she drew was a real bear, except it was a short-faced bear, which went extinct 12,000 years ago."
Mm.
And then Sarah disappears.
Mhm.
So right away, there's this sort of question about, that's the magic realism. Did she really
Mm.
go somewhere? Was it a dream? Was it a memory?
Mm.
And they start telling these stories. And so in the second book, This Adrift, right? I should explain the reason it became a series of books instead of one book was when I started Strongheart, I used a different frame for the story than what the first book is. And the frame was one that like Conrad uses in Heart of Darkness. I don't know if you've ever read that, but these characters go out and they're on a boat waiting for the tide to turn so they can sail. And during that time, this guy tells the story of Kurtz and the Heart of Darkness in Africa. So my story, Strongheart, started with a lifeboat crashing ashore, and they say, "Tell us a story so we don't go nuts." And William tells the story that is the Strongheart story. But then I have thought that's too big a complicated a story, so I took out the frame element, the lifeboat crashing ashore, and just told the Strongheart story. But now I had all these chapters of the lifeboat crashing ashore, and I thought, oh, okay, well, how did the lifeboat crash ashore? And what happened to the ship after the lifeboat crashed ashore? And what about that? So that became another story. I wanted to use those chapters.
Yeah, and I think what's nice, because there is something in what you're writing, because it actually gets into this idea, the timelessness of existence and writing and story, because you create a story that's a linear story of, okay, here's a lifeboat that comes ashore, and then let's tell a story. But then that lifeboat story becomes linearly, sequentially, much later, a year later, and
4 months later, but yeah,
4 months. Okay, yeah.
right.
And so there's this, what it means to sort of be creating story, to be crafting story of, well, does it matter that it's taking place here, there, that there's an overall sense about what's happening. Yeah, I was thinking, because it reminded me, when I didn't remember that that's how Heart of Darkness, but as you spoke, it reminded me of Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which also starts like that. I think there's three men waiting for a ship or something, and the one tells a tale. Because I was thinking about that earlier, because Adrift is a bit like that. It's like water everywhere, but there's a fire on the ship. What are you gonna do
Well,
with
it's
it?
actually it's a vehicle that, I mean, that's what Chaucer did. And essentially,
Yeah.
the Canterbury Tales are all going on
Hmm.
a pilgrimage, and a bunch of people telling stories as they go on this
Yeah.
journey. I mean, yeah, but what happened was I tried that frame, and I still think that would be a good story, but I was having enough trouble getting the book out, and then I thought I'd just simplify it, and that then became the second story. And then, of course, there were some loose ends. Remember in Adrift, how they got these canvas covered boxes in the tunnels, and they don't quite know what they are. And, and Myra's struggling with this mining company and what's going to happen with that. And so you'd think readers are going to, well, I kind of, what happens with those boxes? What happens with the mining company? How do they do? So that was where the third and final book comes out, kind of resolves everything the following summer.
Yeah. And I think even with that frame that we're talking about goes to what you're saying, and we started with, which is story, right? Because what is it that makes us modern humans? And this has been talked about by many others, is our ability to tell stories, right? To create myth, to create a meaning to our existence.
Yes.
However you want to define that, because and does it matter that this is provable or happened or has this? Because what's provable? The truth. Joseph Campbell talks about myth a lot, and specifically, one of the things I always appreciate is, I think Campbell said this, but anyway, may have been other people who said that a myth is something that never happened, but is always true.
Right, right. And I did some research with Campbell, and I did a lot of research with Jung as well on this whole idea, because the idea of the archetype, the idea of, is there such a thing as ancestral memory? And then there's this whole question about, you've got this DNA, and 20% of the DNA, or no, it's less than that. It's like 3% of the DNA is actually what's called coding DNA to do things. And 97% they don't know what it does, and it's called junk DNA. They don't know what it does. So who knows, maybe that can carry memory, maybe that can carry skills from the past, maybe that carries versions of yourself depending on different climatic conditions. We don't know. And that's the wonderful part of all this. So just trying to mix all that together. And in fact, there's a big debate in the anthropological community about what, when were people modern, i.e. burials and religion and art. It appears that there were hominids who looked and had big as brain as we have, but they don't have evidence of burying people or doing anything. So they think around somewhere between 60 and 100,000 years ago, something happened and this explosion of artwork happened. And I've come up with a thesis about that that's not based on any science, but essentially argues that different hominids interbred, which they did, and either a Neanderthal and Erectus, or a couple of them interbred, and something happened in the coding of the brain of their offspring that enabled this thing to happen, right? And so who knows? The wonderful part about all this is, even with science, you think it's proven, but nothing's really proven. It's just a strongly held theory.
Yeah.
And these days, especially with this sort of assault on the truth politically and everything, there's this whole, you look at people arguing about, it's an example, the Wuhan lab thing, and a virus getting out of the lab and all that stuff. And we can't even talk about that. We've reached the point where you can't even raise a contrary view without being accused of being a heretic. And I think humans are sort of like that, very tribal. So the argument here is, we can all think about where we came from and what it means. But in the end, I guess I'd say, I try to provoke people a little bit in these stories, so that when you finish reading the stories, you wonder, well, could that be true? And what about that? And is this really the way it is? But in the end, if it's not a good story, if the reader isn't carried along just because they want to know what happens, then you can't have any messages in it. And the other piece of it is, you can't have it so message heavy that then you just feel like you're reading a religious or environmental pamphlet, and it's not a story at all. It's a story.
Yeah.
At least for me, when I was a kid, I read all the time. And to me, I can remember going to the library and finding a book, and if it was the right kind of book, literally falling into that story. All I want to do is curl up and read that thing for hours.
Yeah.
And that, to me, if a writer can do that with someone, that's the highest definition of success there is. If someone picks the story up and says, I couldn't put it down, that's all you can ask for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and sort of thinking of books or stories that I've reread, right? Because there's things you'd think like, well, I've read that, I've experienced that, then I'm done with that. And there are certain things, I know other friends of mine, and they say, it's been a few years since I read Huck Finn, or since I read I don't know, anything, whatever it is, Adrift, that touches you in some way, that because it goes to that sense of what a story is, right? A story connects us with who we are, and it gives us an understanding, a reasoning for what's happening in our world, in our existence.
Right. Yes, and it hopefully also gives some kind of inspiration or encouragement or faith, or my hope is that if anybody reads like Adrift, even in Adrift, the drive and passion of that girl Sarah, in terms of like just God damn it, we're going to go get William. To hell with this. We're going up there. That, I admire that. A difficult, ornery teenage girl is about the strongest character there is, and I wanted to celebrate that. They're usually condemned and everything. I think it's great.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of a number of the characters, because and maybe you have this from your own experience. There is the kind of salty C character that's quite sort of rough, and it's
Right.
a tough life, right? I mean, you're doing things that can be very, very physical, and you're doing them when you're being sort of jostled up and down all over the place because of the weather, and often in cold, barren, quite challenging environments. And I think there's something else that comes in, because they are sort of salt of the earth or salt of the sea characters. A lot of these people who struggle, right? And there are a lot of people in this that are they're true people, right? It's like they've chosen a particular line of life to could be crew or to run a shipping tug company,
Right.
and the struggles of that. It's not like, well, we're just successful and prosperous. It's like, no, we've got hundreds of thousands in debt, and we're not making any money, and the whole yard's going to be taken over. And so how are we going to even pay for the fuel, let alone
that's the way. I mean, that's the way life is for most people. Like
Exactly.
Steve, the captain. Steve Procida, the captain. Actually, I wrote the book Adrift in 2014, first draft. And in 2016, I was on a ship where the first mate was this guy named Steve Procida, who was balding and overweight and kind of a character from Long Island. And we became very close. We really became friends. He finally told me, I told him I'd write big books. He says, you can use my name. Like, that's his name. But the description of, I was nervous about letting him see the book, because the physical description was exactly the same, but it wasn't intended, right? And the other thing I tried to do, which I've tried with all my books, and I can be condemned for it or not, is that I wanted to have stories where the women are just as strong as the men. I mean, Louise is one tough lady, right? And Myra is a tough daughter who's trying to balance this thing with the tribe and the mining company while her father's missing. And Sarah's an ornery, tough girl. I'm trying to put up women who are, in fact, in all my stories, the women are stronger than the men in some ways. And actually, women like to read them because it's a little bit out of the mold of what you'd I mean, you don't even expect a woman to be running a tugboat, let alone. But anyway, it was fun to do that.
I just want to add, because you mentioned it, and it's just sort of coming back to me. So at the age of 65, you decided to become a merchant marine. Which is an interesting adventure in itself. I mean, and you said you spoke to your wife about it. I'm really curious to just hear a little bit about that experience.
Okay, so when I was a kid, I mean, we hadn't had seafarers in our family since the 1800s, and there weren't that many. When I was a kid, growing up in inland Massachusetts, a boy down the street went to the Merchant Marine Academy. He was older than me by about 10 years. His name was David Wyman. And I thought it was something I wanted to do. I wanted to, I read Howard Pyle. I read all these sea stories. I always wanted to go to sea. Never did with the Merchant Marine. I went to a different school. So then I went fishing. I did go to sea fishing on smaller boats, and I did that for a number of years. I loved it. It was, I mean, lots of stories. But small boat, dangerous as hell. We had our share of horrible things. And I did that. And then what happened was I worked for seaports. And I worked for this port, and at 62, I was basically retired from the place I'd been working. The guy who was running it wanted to put in charge of a younger woman, actually. It's kind of what happens. You're an old white guy. And so I was, but I applied for and got a job as the executive director of a small port up in Northwest Washington. And I went up there, but I knew when I went up there that I wasn't going to get along with one of the elected commissioners because I'd been warned about him from day one, but I thought I can handle it. And well, I couldn't handle it. You know, we got crossways in 2 seconds. And so after a year and a half, I was at the age of 65, I was pushed out. Well, before I went up to that other port where I thought I was going to have to leave the first place I was at, my son had gone to work for the Sailors Union of the Pacific because I'd suggested this to him as a way to make some money, and he was sailing with them. And I knew the business agent. And what I did was I spent a lot of time getting my sea time from when I was fishing 30 years before to get my ticket to be a sailor, because you need sea time, right? Mm-hmm. So I had my sea time, and then I got run out of the port of Bellingham, and my wife and I sat down, we talked, said, okay, you know, she'd found a job. I had to keep working. So I said, look, I want to try to go back to sea. And he said, okay, go down to the hall. Right. And after a couple of months of going down to the hall, you know, I get hired as an ordinary seaman. And the next thing I know, I'm flying to New York and I'm on a 902-foot container ship heading to Singapore. I mean, there was other things. I did some training, and there was fire training and a bunch of other things. But I was the oldest guy in the ship, except for the boatswain, who was like 6 months older than me. And you know, I survived. You know, I mean, I was okay. I was fit enough to survive. And I did it for 4 years, and then it stopped when I was in my 70th year. I said, okay, enough is enough. Enough is enough. I want to write these stories. But it was a great decision because it was a way. I mean, remember when I did this, it's 2012 when I went back to sea, and my wife hadn't been able to get work because of the the crash in the mid 2000s. She'd gone back to school, and then 4 years couldn't find a job. She finally found a job just when I got this job up north, and then when I got turned away from there, it wasn't enough, so I had to do something, and I did this, and it actually worked out beautifully for a lot of reasons. I had the illusion that I could write my stories as I was on the ship, but no. I mean, I had my notebooks with me, but let me tell you, you're working. You're either standing watch or you're chipping rust. I mean, that's it, you know, or sleeping.
Yeah.
So it was, but it was, you know, and it was very, I mean, I admire the people who do it, you know, the guys who've done it all their lives. It's a tough thing. You're never home. You never see your family. It's a rough way to live. You make pretty decent money, you know, but it's a big price to that. There's a big price to that.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, the other thing I'd say is that actually all over the world, it's common for people elsewhere, for the husband or the wife or someone to go somewhere else to work, like all those people working in the Middle East from India because the local people won't do it. So I've been a remote worker a few times in my life, and that's really the way it is for many, many, many people. And it's hard, but just the way it is. And it's the same way when you're at sea, you know, you're at sea, and but it's okay. I mean, you manage because you have to.
Yeah. And is there a sense, because you started the story back where you were growing up and had this, you know, vision or idea, is there a sense of kind of like completing, you know, your own story? It's like, gosh, you know, I always kind of wanted to do this. And so there is a sense of accomplishment or fulfillment, maybe is more.
I think I don't think, I'm glad I didn't go to the Maritime Academy and be a sailor all my life, because I don't think in the end, I think I would have enjoyed it, but I'm glad I didn't do it, I guess. Yeah, I'm glad I did it. I mean, just like I'm a whore for experiences, because if you want to write, I want to have experience to write from. I don't feel comfortable writing about things that I haven't been personally exposed to at all. So, you know, I can't fake that. Partly the reason my books are set in the woods or on the water or arguing about permits is that's what I've been involved with. So I think I can comfortably write about it. I'm not going to be, I couldn't do a very good job writing about the fashion industry or being a professional photographer. You know, really, I couldn't, it's just not, it just wouldn't read right, I don't think. It wouldn't be realistic. My hope is the way it's, you want to be authentic, you know, I mean, if you can. But the idea of trying to wrestle with this idea about what really happened in the past and how did we become modern humans and what is the power of myth and can some of these ancient legends be true and what do we really know today? I mean, I'm always conscious of the fact that not so many years ago, if you argued the earth was round, they'd burn you. You know, you'd be burned at the stake. I mean, that was only like 400 years ago, which is a long time. But today, you see the same sort of thing happening where if you don't hold a certain set of beliefs, you're thought of as a pariah, as almost non-human. Well, that's human nature, is to believe these things whether they're true or not. So who knows? You know, so my hope is that the reader, when the reader, there's not so much of it in Adrift. There's much more magic realism in the first book, and then the third book, a lot of it. And I want the reader to be asking the question: is what these people are talking about something they dreamed about, or memory of, or did they actually do it? And I'm deliberately ambiguous about it because my observation is different readers will take it different ways. You might be very literal and want nothing to do with this, but other people, no problem. They go right to it because they like magic. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you know, like I think I've said, but the compelling nature of the story just, you know, takes you through. I mean, I kind of rushed through, you know, quite like voraciously got through the book because it was a compelling story. You know, it wasn't. There is a. It's really interesting. You were talking earlier about, you know, the sense of you know, having things be realistic. So this is what happened. This is what the nautical terms of, or how somebody, a seaman, or would speak about things, right? You're not gonna, somebody's not gonna say, oh, hand me that cable over there, the black one, that they're gonna talk whatever, you know, whatever it is, the thing is, right? But it's not a technical thing where you're kind of like, oh gosh, this is really you know, hard and intricate, and you know, because there is a lot of description, but a lot of what I also noticed is a lot of the book is dialogue, and so there's a lot of, and you can do a lot with dialogue, right? You can, because there's, you know, we're having conversation, and so you get to things. It's not kind of flowery language of, oh, he was thinking this and then had this wondering thought that kind of, you know, takes 5 pages to get to. You kind of, you know, again, you get quite direct. It's like the person says it and there's a response, and then this happens. Like there's a lot of description that comes from people saying what's happening or what they're doing or what they're feeling in the moment.
Yeah, I think it's hard to describe a style, but one of the writers that I admired tremendously is Elmore Leonard, who wrote Westerns and then wrote about Detroit and then wrote about Miami. And he's a master of dialogue and a master of spare prose. And I try to be spare in my prose as to the degree I can. I mean, I don't know if I'm successful. And I try to be, you know, you're in the moment. We all live moment to moment, and I try to write it that way. So, and I try to reveal the characters through what they say as much as what they do. I don't, for example, and I don't think this is wrong, I don't spend a lot of time describing how they look, just a few little things, because I think every reader will fill in the blanks the way they want. They'll picture you know what I mean? They'll picture the person the way they want. I'm trying to go with the story. Now, other writers don't go that way, and they're very, very good. I mean, there are many different ways of writing well. If you go back to stories you read and read again, I've read the Lord of the Rings trilogy probably 4 times, and a couple of times I've read them to my boys, the whole damn trilogy, and I love those stories. And another story I can tell you, which I think is very revealing, is when I was in high school, we studied Moby Dick. We all studied Moby Dick in high school. And, it was, there's a 600-page book, right? And I remember he'd say, you got to read these chapters. And I remember struggling with that book because it was all about the allegory. And then there were long chapters about the gear, like the cordage and everything. And he'd skip those chapters. And I was in the 10th grade. I hated it. I hated Moby Dick. So now fast forward 10 or 15 years, we're offshore, the wind's blowing, fishing, right? Way out lobster fishing on Ladonia Canyon. And we're blowing around and I'm looking for something to read, right? I mean, there's all these skin magazines on the boat and the hell with them. I wanted a book to read. And I found under the skipper's mattress up in the pilot house, a copy of Moby Dick. I said, oh shit, it's just Moby Dick. And I picked it up. And because I'd been to sea and was at sea, I opened the first page and it was like I read that book in 10 minutes. I read the whole thing. It was great. And the contrast from being forced to read at 10, where I knew, at the 10th grade where I didn't know, and now reading this thing where I knew something about what he was writing about was staggering. It was just staggering. So who's to say what you in this moment of time might enjoy? 10 years or 15 years from now, you may like something very, very different.
Yeah, actually, I mean, it was a nonfiction book I picked up and read recently that I had on my shelf that I started 10 years ago, and I thought it was absolute junk, and I found it and I read it and I read it in like a week's time. I was like, this is amazing. I don't know why I thought this was junk. So yeah, we come to different things. I want to get to just kind of maybe end with something that you started with, and your own personal connection to land. You spoke about Olympic National Park, and there is this sense of like we were talking about the heart of land, and this sense of like, bear energy, and there's a particular, I lived in Portland, Oregon for a brief period of time, about 6 months. And so I have an appreciation and really love there's a spirit, of that area. And I know it's something that, you've really connected with, and you hike and you really connect with that place. And you spoke about it at the beginning. So I just, I'd love to hear sort of what it is, what it is about the land and this particular place, or that calls to you.
Well, all right. Well, this goes back a long way. My grandfather, in the early years of the 20th century, spent a lot of time in on the Pacific Northwest and in the Yukon and Alaska. He was kind of a naturalist and hunter, and he got active with fighting for the national park up in Mount McKinley, Denali National Park. And so he took my father hiking and camping all the time, canoeing. And so when I grew up, that's what I did. And my father, in the Depression, when he got out of college, he ended up working in the logging woods in Washington State. And he did that for 2 or 3 years until his sisters fell ill and he came back east to help take care of them. But he said, he always talked about the logging woods, right? And I was always interested in the logging woods. And he'd tell me about college, think about the University of Washington, anyway, so, and then I drove around the country in 1967 when I was 20, and we drove through part of Washington, and I'd forgotten this, but I'd wanted to go to the Olympic National Park because when I was in the 8th grade, National Geographic had an article about an Olympic National Park, and my best friend at the time, and I used to hike a lot together in college and graduate school, we both vowed we're going to go to Olympic National Park. And then he got killed in an avalanche in 1976. And so he couldn't go to Olympic National Park. So all these factors came around. And then I had a chance where I was working in New York, and I had a chance to come out to the West Coast. And I thought I was going to come out to the West Coast to be on fish boats, actually. But I knew if I got out here, I could go to the Olympic National Park, which I'd never gotten to. So I did. We moved out here and I went to the park. And I love that place. I just love that place. I don't know why. It's just, and when I'm done with the Olympic National Park, I'll try another park, but I'm not done with it yet. so, so that's what, it's just, and there are a lot of people who love the place. The Olympic National Park, it was a reserve set up by under Teddy Roosevelt, I think, and there's tremendous timber resources in it. And in 1938, the President Roosevelt came out to the Olympic National Park in this area, and the idea was that the robber barons, the timber barons, wanted him to release land for logging, and he basically said, "This is a hell of a place. I'm going to make it a national park." And he created a national park in 1938, which pissed off the timber industry. But it's a 1 million acre park, so and I've probably spent 500 days in that park now in the 30 years. It's not that much, but it's something. And there's a lot of people out here who love that place, and it's kind of unique. So I just wanted to celebrate it some way, and celebrate being out in the wilderness. And I guess finally, I also wanted to have a story structure where an ornery young girl finds her power in a place that people usually associate with men or boys, not women and girls. And I wanted her to find her power in the wilderness in a way that worked, and she does. And that's I didn't want it to be a boy. I want it to be a girl.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could kind of continue spinning yarns and hearing your stories, but I feel like we've kind of reached a good arc and a good appreciation for what you've created, particularly with these 3 stories. And we'll have notes about them in the show notes, so people can find the exact description of them.
Right.
Yeah, I think thank you so much for coming on, sharing your story, and the stories that you've created, and what's gone into them, what's behind those stories. I think it's really beautiful to see, kind of, as I said, like kind of peeling back the curtain of what happens and why.
Well, I really appreciate this, and it's fun to talk about this. It's fun to hear people who read the stories, and I hope people pick it up. I actually changed the system so that Adrift and Strongheart are both, you can get them for 99 cents, the Kindle version for 99 cents from now until October, when the 3rd one, Totem, comes out. I want as many people as possible to see the first 2 stories, maybe to get interested in the 3rd story. But in the end, it's always about the reader. The reader picks up the book, and either they fall into it, and that's great. But if they don't fall into it, that's great too. It's not for everybody. It's just the way it's just the way it works. So,
yeah. I love your attitude. I love your adventurous spirit that you have lived and you bring into your stories. So thank you. Thanks so much, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Taylor. I appreciate it.